Thanks for coming along today. We've got a reasonably tight timetable for these presentations, so I'll move through it reasonably quickly. I've had the fortune of being involved, I guess, in the ugly end of the waste management industry, or perhaps the more difficult end with problematic wastes, particularly, I guess, what was originally hazardous wastes, but the movement of hazardous waste is, the term has changed dramatically. It used to be something from industry, and no one ever used to consider domestic sources of hazardous and problematic waste. But I think that's changing very, very quickly, and I'll run through some of the programs and types of waste, and I guess some of the emerging issues in this sector, because there are certainly many. But I guess in terms of managing, and I'm going to use the term problematic wastes, in terms of managing problematic wastes, one of the things that we're always trying to highlight to people is that you need to minimise the entire the risk associated with the entire life cycle of the waste. So one of the things that we often see is that, like in the waste industry in general, waste tends to find the lowest common denominator. So it'll find the cheapest point of disposal regardless of the environmental outcome. I guess I just wanted to highlight just a recent example where in Victoria there's been an industry anomaly where there's been, of the order of 20,000 tonnes a year of high-level hazardous waste which has found its way from communities, from industry, from a whole range of suppliers, and was illegally dumped into a number of warehouses in Victoria. Now, everyone's probably aware there's been a number of fires, I guess, in the recycling industry and in the hazardous waste management industry, but it really, to me, just highlights the need, to really not just get rid of the material, not just put it on a truck and let it go, but to actually understand where the material goes, and to also have schemes that make it easy for people to get rid of these types of materials, because they're difficult. You don't just put them in a bin in a curbside collection. You need some type of accessible scheme to be able to get rid of these materials. That photograph on the screen there, that's literally a month old, and that was a factory operated by Bradbury's in Victoria. They had 100 fire brigade, evacuated a bunch of schools, communities. There was burning solvents running down the drains. Really, a very strong image of what can go wrong if things aren't managed properly. And I think if you are looking, I think particularly from a local government perspective, which is the focus of the audience, it's really about making sure that you can provide your community with some safe and sustainable outlets for these materials, but making sure that you do your due diligence on the pathways. So really, what are problematic wastes? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these, and some of them people would be aware of, and some of them people wouldn't be aware of, but you certainly will over the forthcoming future. So some of the very common examples are household hazardous waste. So if everyone's got a garage at home, typically you've got a shelf that's got a whole bunch of old pesticides and paints and thinners and car chemicals, there's a variety of different things that come in the stream. So that's what we call household hazardous waste, which is a very large stream, and obviously not one that you put in your general waste bin. So there needs to be a program for them. Things like oils, batteries. Batteries are becoming an incredibly difficult waste stream to manage in Australia. Lithium batteries, everybody's got one. They're going to be a massive issue for communities. E-waste, there's a fair bit of talk about e-waste. I run one of the main e-waste recycling facilities in Victoria, so I can touch on that a little. Asbestos, of course, contaminated soils, particularly in areas. There's often old service stations that are contaminated. There could be asbestos contaminated soils. There can be more industrial contaminated soils, and obviously with land redevelopment that becomes a major issue. Then there's other things, different types of liquids. There's a lot of drill muds that are getting generated from the hydro excavation. Everywhere you drive these days, you see a tanker on the side of the road where they're actually digging with water to avoid cutting services. There's a lot of material generated from those. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about this new group of chemicals. People have probably seen in the press a lot about PFAS. They're a very persistent, nasty chemical that has really come to light around Australia, particularly associated with defence sites and firefighting activities, and it's causing all sorts of problems in the industry. So I might start off there because I think it is, relatively interesting. So just who has heard of PFAS? Just raise your hand if you could. I'm never sure whether people are interested in it because of the audience, but I will talk a little bit about it. So what makes a chemical nasty? There's a group of chemicals called persistent organic pollutants, and they are things that fundamentally they're very strong. They don't like to break down in the environment. So some of the ones that we're very commonly associated with are things like DDT, which you've heard of, PCBs. They often contain chlorine, or what they call halogens, and carbon, but they've got very, very strong bonds. Now, this little critter, most of them are insoluble. So if you pour them down, if they go out in the environment, they tend to not mix with water, so they don't distribute particularly heavily. This particular group of chemicals is the opposite to that. It's incredibly water soluble. So it has these really nasty little carbon fluorine bonds, which are very difficult to break down, and it's extremely soluble, and it bioaccumulates. So it really is the trifecta for hazardous waste, and they're in absolutely everything, and we've only just started looking for them. If I took a sample of your blood, I can absolutely guarantee you that you will have hits. It's a bit like plastic in the ocean. It is everywhere. There is a whole host of these chemicals, so it's not one in isolation. But I think in terms of communities, there's some really significant issues with these because they're so widespread. Basically, any area, whether it be a fire station that used foam at any point in time, is likely to be contaminated, and it's likely to go through to the groundwater. So in terms of local communities and development, we're finding them absolutely everywhere, and the issues associated with that, particularly in terms of the impacts to communities. So there's obviously human health and environmental impacts, but not more importantly, as a side effect of that, there's major impacts to property values. My parents-in-law bought a property in the red zone in Newcastle and Williamtown and probably lost about $200,000 off the land value because it was declared in the red zone for this particular contaminant. So it's a very real issue, and it's one that's going to become very mainstream in various communities. It's also going to have a very large impact on landfills because a lot of landfills, even in the foams and whether it be whatever type of general waste has gone into the landfill, a lot of these PFAS molecules have transferred to the leachate. So as you pump out the leachate, what do you do with it? You put it through a water treatment plant, winds up going to a sewage treatment plant, sticks to the biosolids then get land applied. So it does this lovely little circle back around. If you stick the biosolids back in the landfill where you're just concentrating it. And we don't really have a lot of solutions for this waste stream at the moment, so it's going to become a very major issue in Australia. So in terms of problematic wastes around Australia, there is a silent national set of infrastructure. It's a very, doesn't get a lot of press, but there's a variety of different facilities located around Australia, and the market is very much national. You will see waste move from Victoria to Western Australia, it moves all around the country depending on what types of materials you're talking about. For Cleanaway, which is the organisation I work for, we have 20 sort of state-of-the-art facilities around Australia, and we do, if you look in this room, we have, if you take a flat screen like this that needs to be recycled but also contains mercury, we have a recycling technology that does that. That's a problematic waste. If you look at lighting, fluorescent lighting, for example, they contain mercury. We have a recycling facility that. Even the air that we're breathing here, we have a refrigeration unit out the side, which is obviously full of CFCs, which people know about. We run the destructive process for those CFCs in Australia. So there's this mass industry that people aren't aware of that is very, very important, critical infrastructure for Australia. And I think if you look at the fires like occurred in Victoria, it really actually demonstrates to society how critical the infrastructure is associated with this hazardous waste management industry. One thing I did want to touch on, particularly given the audience, is some of the community schemes that are available, because I think they're the point of access for most communities to get rid of their materials. And really what's fantastic in recent years is it's become accessible for people to get rid of these materials. So some of the schemes that are worth calling out is a lot of the funded schemes. New South Wales EPA, for example, in New South Wales and Victoria, it's Sustainability Victoria, and there's various schemes around Australia, but they operate outstanding community recycling services where they have both fixed drop-off centres and curbside collections, basically, where they'll set up in a council car park. And everyone can bring out their debt effectively. You empty out your garage of all of the sins that you might accumulate, and they go down very viable disposal pathways. There's also a lot of product stewardship regimes that are around. So for example, when a litre of paint gets sold, there's a certain amount of the money that goes back into recycling that paint. And that is aimed at diverting these materials for landfill and providing a more sustainable outcome for these waste streams. Fully funded, very strong access, so there's enormous range of places that people can get rid of these materials at the moment. And I think from a council's perspective, it's very important that you can tap into these schemes and make use of them and make yourself available for them. There's other schemes that are around. There's the NTRS for e-waste. So I know we've got a presentation on e-waste coming up. That's an excellent scheme for electronic goods, particularly flat screens, televisions, that type of thing. And then AgSafe is a long-running, again, outstanding service for agricultural chemicals, which are very, very important to regional communities. In terms of the market drivers for hazardous waste, community expectations extremely high. Obviously, people want access to get rid of these materials. Standards very important for our industry, landfill bans, those types of things. Levies are a major driver again for our industry, so it really focuses on problematic and hazardous wastes can actually be recycled or reused. If you dispose of a can of paint or some thinners, it's very likely that will be used for energy recovery in a cement kiln, which is a very good environmental outcome for that particular product. The packaging will be recycled. Landfill acceptance criteria, really, really important that that's regulated and that we don't let materials go into landfill that shouldn't go into landfill. It's obviously very topical. One of the other major market drivers is the investment support. There's a lot of schemes around that provide particularly co-funding for new technologies. A lot of people say, why haven't we got this technology? Very, very simple metric. As a commercial organisation, typically you have superannuation funds that own your shares. You need to be able to generate a return on capital, say above 10% profit after tax over the capital that you employ. If you're moving into a new, innovative technology, it's often hard to hit that investment hurdle. That's where the co-funding arrangements from organisations like Sustainability Victoria or New South Wales EPA, they lower the barrier to entry so that you can actually make that investment. And that's really, really critical because it actually gets the service running, and then after a while, you can stand up on your own 2 feet. I did mention too, there's a lot of emerging waste streams that are becoming available and worth keeping an eye on, and make sure that you maintain being educated. I guess just in conclusion, I'm mindful of time. Problematic waste, I think, is becoming increasingly focused in part of the community, and part of it is press. There's been an enormous amount. When I turned on Sunrise, which I always do on my iPad in the morning, and they're actually got a helicopter zooming over a hazardous waste treatment facility on fire, and they're making note that communities have been evacuated, you know that it's front and centre of people's mind. The PFAS has been another very big one. So all of a sudden, these problematic wastes are getting onto the front page of the paper. I've had this front page many years ago when a major chemical manufacturer in the Hunter had an uncontrolled release of hexavalent chrome over a community, and they made the front page of the paper, enormous amount of press. I guess my point is, if that was an uncontrolled release, but a lot of these things can be avoided by just making sure you know where your material's going and you access the right schemes. I think there's obviously a need for considering the entire life cycle of problematic waste, a lot of big role for government. I guess we've always got to consider the impact to human health and the environment, which is very, very real. These contaminants are nasty, nasty little critters. I could, show you 1,000 nasty injuries that have occurred during my career in this particular space. If I leave you with one message out of the presentation today, there are numerous funded arrangements that are out there to support communities. I mentioned the New South Wales EPA CRC drop-offs, Paintback, excellent product stewardship organisation. NTRS for the e-waste, among others. So please, make the most of those. Educate yourself as to what schemes are available, and if you have someone in your community that wants to get rid of a material, make sure it's easy for them. Make sure that as a council you provide some space for these organisations to set up, because they'll make it a lot easier for you moving forward. And I guess just in summary, there's a very big role for government in this. The industry can't just sort out the problems for the community. There's a big role for government with all sorts of those tools that I talked about: product stewardship, landfills, accessibility, all of those types of things. But that's pretty much it for me, just to try to keep on time. But I'm happy to answer a couple of questions.